Tonight, we're going to follow shorelines that moved and streets that learned to breathe water, places where doorways now open into blue and market squares sway with seagrass. Long after the last footsteps faded, the sea kept their stories page by page in sand and silt. Before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and settle in, loosen your shoulders, and let your breath match the tide. Because the most surprising thing about these lost civilizations is not that they vanished, but how clearly they still speak from beneath the waves. First, there is distance, broad, bright distance, where the horizon sits farther away and the air tastes faintly of minerals carried on long winds that have crossed dry shelves now hidden under blue. Rivers run through grasslands that will one day learn the color of the sea, stitching channels across flats where cranes feed and stone points fall from hands and vanish into reeds. Villages watch the tide as a spectacle rather than a neighbor. Children race it along sand that stretches for miles, their footprints filling slowly with the gentle breath of evening. The world feels spacious, and the shore is a long whisper between realms, firm underfoot, predictable in its curve. A familiar margin where boats rest at low water like sleeping animals and rise again without hurry when the moon asks. Change begins in increments too small to measure, except by the patience of memory. Winters soften, the old ice far away and everywhere at once, loosens its grip a little more each season, and water that has known the weight of centuries stands up and walks downhill. The ocean accepts this newcomer without ceremony, lifting itself by the width of a finger, then another, spreading the gain thinly across basins that look no different from one day to the next. Yet the line where land meets sea is an attentive instrument. It hears the quiet rise like a new note in a familiar song. Storms that once reached only to the second dune now brush the third. A high tide finds the toe of a bluff, and liking the taste, returns the next moon to ask for more. What had been a margin becomes a conversation. Sandbars reorganize into ribbons that steer the waves, then vanish, then reappear a little closer to the dunes. Beaches grow steeper as swash and backwash redraw their equilibrium for a taller sea. In one cove, a clean, pale scarp appears overnight where yesterday there was only slope, a fresh page exposing layers of shell and charcoal laid down by hands and campfires no one alive remembers. The tide, amplified by a long fetch and a sudden slant of wind, climbs the new face and leaves strings of wrack like delicate handwriting. Among the eelgrass and driftwood, a carved peg or a bead of baked clay turns in the foam and settles in a place it was never meant to be. People notice not the single tide, but the trend. The path to the harbor needs a new stepping stone. The mark on the quay where fathers measured spring highs with a fingertip sits lower on the wall than a grandfather could have imagined. Rivers adjust with a patience that looks like confidence. Their lower reaches slow under the weight of a taller base level, and their mouths widen into soft, shining funnels where fresh and salt weave without conflict. The taste of the water changes first at the bend, then at the ferry crossing, then under the window of a house that has never before watched mullet flash among pilings. Sediment, once hurried into deep water, now rests in quieter eddies, building bars and shoals that migrate like thoughts across a broadening estuary. Fish discover new nurseries. Reeds sculpt the flow into corridors. The map of the delta spreads like a fan, each new distributary testing a line, each green tongue crossing yesterday's channel and forgetting it kindly. From a hill at dusk, lamplights begin to appear farther inland than last year, where boats now tie at fresh stakes set in the firmest mud available, and voices carry over the water because the water has come nearer to listen. Coastlines that were once cliffs learn the small grammar of surrender. Wave-cut notches sharpen, and the ledges above them hollow into rooms where swallows lay nests that will one day open into blue. A fall of rock writes an abrupt paragraph at the base of a headland. The sea reads it, grinds its nouns into adjectives, lifts its conjunctions on surf, and scatters its fine verbs along the next pocket beach. Caves lengthen by a careful meter. Blowholes wake and cough salt breath on afternoons when the swell arrives from a particular quarter. Where the stone is soft, chalk, marl, the old bones of reefs, towers become islands, and islands thin to reefs. At low tide, their backs break the surface like the spines of old creatures resting, and at high tide, their shapes translate into the drag and boil of water that knows something is there. A path that used to run dry to a promontory becomes a causeway useful only at dawn. Then even dawn draws her skirt out of reach, and the promontory reintroduces itself as an island whose name takes a tide to pronounce. In low places, the sea enters without argument. Marshes accept the taller water and climb by knitting roots, catching silt, lifting themselves millimeter by millimeter on the scaffolding of last year's stems. Lagoons trade whispers with the outer ocean through new inlets opened by a single storm and kept open by the practicing of tide. Barriers, long, narrow, and bilingual, migrate landward under patient washovers that set down pale fans of sand across their backs. Grasses trace those fans with green lines and pin them with roots that stitch despite the tug of wind. Behind the barriers, ponds sweeten and salt in a rhythm that lengthens, their shores stepping up in muddy staircases of fallen reed and snail shell. Each step a calendar for creatures that live on the edge by choice rather than by exile. Farther inland, lakes that once were fed only by rain begin to taste the coast on a strong onshore day. A hint of iodine in cattails that flex to a breeze they did not expect to hear so clearly. Human rooms tilt toward water as if listening. Piers grow longer. Their outermost posts creak with a new depth of calm between chop. House thresholds, once 2 handspans above the spray line, gain a stone, then another, then a board raised on pegs that dries quicker after tide. Paths wander upslope and tighten into lanes between gardens, newly planted on terraces where vines can still find warmth, but the roots breathe air after rain. Drying racks step backward from the beach like gulls at a playful wave. Pottery kilns move to a ridge. The new well is tapped in a fold where the rock promises his sweet water a little longer. Boat builders adjust hulls for harbors with fewer stones and more current. Fishermen set their weirs a bend upstream. Markets open earlier to catch the stillness before the sea breeze walks up the valley and fluffs every canvas shade into a small sail. Stories keep pace with the line of foam. Children learn to count not only moons, but markers, old willow, broken post, the notch in the quay wall. And how many hands of water stand over them on a spring high? Elders remember when a dune cut the wind on a winter night that now looks across open water. They point with a spoon and say the word for a pasture the sea has taken into its mouth as calmly as bread. Songs change a syllable. Prayers add the harbor's threshold to the list of things kissed at festival time. The name of the town shifts by a letter to fit the new geography better in the mouth. Flood tales aged into family stories. How a trunk floated into a courtyard and turned itself into a table. How a boat, released in a fever of fear, returned 2 days later with a dog asleep under a net. How the oldest neighbor moved inland without complaint, saying the sea had paid its rent on that strip of earth and might keep it with honor. Evidence gathers in the quiet places where we rarely looked before. At extreme low tides, black stumps of old forest rise from the sand like the knuckles of giants at rest, their rings smooth to the touch, their roots still clutching the clay that formed around them before the first fish swam over their crowns. A line of rounded stones appears far offshore, aligned with a grace that no wave would bother to arrange. Stand above them in a small boat, and the compass ticks a soft degree, as if remembering the iron in old nails. On fair days, when the sea lies like glass and the sun steps high, a square shadow shows under the surface. Too regular for reef, too neat for accident, and the mind draws streets where the eye is cautious. Divers speak of doorways felt with the palm more than seen, thresholds buried to the ankle in silt that holds small shells like buttons, and on some afternoons a fragment of fired clay washes ashore, still wearing the thumbprint of the person who smoothed it. The pace is not the same everywhere. In one bay, a strand line lifts by a hand each year for a decade, then rests and lets sand pile enough to grow a new ribbon of grass. In another, a headland holds for a century before a single winter lifts its edge and the cliff moves back the width of a cottage. Farther south, where rivers bring mountains ground to silt and the sea is shallow and warm, coastlines leap and rest, building mile-wide deltas in lifetimes, and then abandoning a branch to seek a steeper path. Farther north, where the crust rises in polite rebound from the weight it once bore, the sea's advance is slowed by the earth itself standing up millimeter by millimeter, and people on those shores tell a different story, not of loss exactly, but of a negotiation in which land and water trade small favors with admirable manners. Even underground, the change writes itself into stone. Caverns that once breathed only the air of hills learn the taste of tide. In their mouths, stalagmites grow skins of glossy mineral laid by brackish drips, and in blue holes and sinkholes the sea moves inland along dark corridors, bringing fish to rooms that have never known them. Springs near the coast freshen at ebb and brine, at flood, by a fraction so fine it can be told only by the plants that grow at their edges, halos of green that slide up and down the bank like a careful hand trying for a perfect line. Wells that tapped the lens of fresh water floating on seawater now taste the lens thinning, and new wells are dug uphill where the stone gives up a steadier sweetness, the rope creaking on a new pulley, the bucket rising with the same clay grin it always had. Language adapts without effort. The old word for shoreline, which once meant a simple path between sea and field, acquires flavors. The runnel between two dunes where the wind hums, the rib of shingle that sings underfoot, the flat of mud that keeps secrets in summer and tells them in winter, the bold face of a chalk cliff too pale to look at noon. People learn to say, the sea came up to here with a fingertip on a wall, and to say, we backed the fence to there with a knuckle on a map. Fishermen add terms for the new eddies in the expanded mouth. Ferrymen teach the names of backwaters that didn't exist when they were small. Shepherds trade with boatmen for passes across creeks that used to be banks. The calendar grows a new day, the night of the long tide, when the moon stands fat and high and the water climbs a finger above the last highest, and everyone walks to see where it pauses and pivots back. Through it all, the sea remains courteous in its persistence. It knocks, it learns the weight of each stone. It takes what loosens and returns what it cannot carry as sand on a different shore. It is not a thief, but a translator, copying one script into another with fidelity to meaning, even when the letters change beyond recognition. Fields become flats rich with eelgrass and fish. Roads become channels that guide shoals. Courtyards become coves where juveniles grow through safe afternoons thick with light. Cemeteries, those quietest of grids, become reefs whose ranks shelter new bones with less ceremony but equal care. And the people who stand at the edge, season after season, learn to read this translation not as erasure, but as a long retelling in which their part continues, moving a little inland, turning a little toward the river, and always watching the line where blue rewrites the world with a patient hand. At first, the city beneath the water looks like a mirage, a suggestion pulled into shape by the angle of sun and the lazy roll of swell. But as you descend through the pale, green-bright column, outlines harden. A quay reveals itself as a long, right-angled shadow where fish turn in unison, their scales shivering like coins. Steps emerge, softened to rounded lips by centuries of patient abrasion, each riser holding a seam of sand and a hairline of weed. You can follow the curve of a harbour arm by the way light bends, sheeted along the old stone blocks as if the sun is running its palm over the work. Columns lie sleeping at angles that would alarm them if they still remembered weight. Capitals face sideways, their carved leaves now furred with algae that sways on a tide tuned to a slower century. Doorways keep the habit of right angles even in blue, cross thresholds with a fingertip, and you feel the old craft, the mason's smooth insistence. Beneath the soft skin, the sea has lent. Inside what once were rooms, the sea has rearranged furniture into gardens. Fallen beams, now softened to bone, host fields of small anemones that open and close like careful hands. Tiles, still locked in herringbone or checker, reflect a broken sun and provide warm flats for sleeping octopuses. Their inks stain the water a shade when startled, then clear with a courtesy that belongs to a place where everything learns to pass through everything else. Amphorae sit upright in corners, their mouths silted shut, the curve of their shoulders dusted with the fine grit of time. Lift one, and the sand falls like dry rain. Set it down, and a small swirl writes a spiral that lasts a minute before being edited into the general flow. In courtyards, the echo is different now. The slap of a curious fish's tail, the small click of shell on shell, the faint rasp of a crab, examining the edge of a marble step, as though the city speaks, but has forgotten to raise its voice. Streets run true where current allows. Long lanes are marked by strips of brightness where stone keeps weeds at bay. Narrower alleys become tunnels of seagrass that part and rejoin with the confidence of curtains that know their rails. A marketplace holds its open square even as its corners round. The stalls are suggested by low walls, by the rhythm of foundations whose measurements still make sense to feet, even to fins. Here, a ring of pillars indicates a fountain that now fills from below. Bubbles thread up from a crack in the central bowl, silver beads that scribble their way to the surface where waves erase the handwriting and wait for another paragraph. There, a lintel wears a relief of a god smoothed to anonymity. Even faceless, the figure does its work, reminding anyone who passes that this was a threshold, and thresholds are counted. You can follow the route of a processional road by the width that remains between the houses, by the slight camber that once carried rain toward drains now learned by fish as shortcuts. Along it, statues tilt in polite conversations with sand. A lion has lost a paw and finds a hermit crab installed in its heel. A pair of twins wear beards of fine weed. A horse's flared nostrils offer shelter to small shrimp that blink like punctuation when a shadow crosses. Inscribed blocks lie soft as bread in their beds of silt. Run a thumb along grooves that once held paint, and your glove lifts a film of fine history that resettles and becomes part of another layer. Not far off, a granary stretches into long, low vaults where sound travels as a low hum. Schools of fish slip through the arches like citizens late for something, and the silt here is stirred into billows that settle again in minutes, preserving the impression of movement without keeping the chaos. Some spaces have kept their acoustics. Enter a bathhouse, and the water thickens with memory. Semi-domes hold a hush, and your breath becomes part of the room's design. Mosaic floors hold fields of tesserae that still know how to catch light. The blues deepen with depth. The reds burn as though storing sunsets. Broken edges soften into pebbles set side by a patient tide. Between the tiles, tiny shells have mortared themselves in, filling the gaps with engineering drawn from softness. In a tepidarium, a fish floats motionless against a faint current that streams through the lacunae of ancient heating channels. Drift a hand toward the hypercaust, and the silt lifts like a sigh, then falls back, describing the unseen architecture with settling lines. Courtyards have become nurseries. The square of sky above is now a ceiling of sea, and its light arrives like a ritual. Sparrowfish peck in corners where food collects in small eddies. Juveniles seethe in clouds that flex with the arrival of shadow. A lone ray glides over threshold and lintel as if to remind stone that flight is possible in another medium. In one yard, a fig's roots, now mineralized, lace the wall that once gave it trellis. Snails traverse that fossil net in patient spirals, tasting minerals and microbes alike. In another, a small well mouth shows as a perfect circle. Peer in, and you see another city. Mud tubes of worms spiraling like ammonites, tiny crabs turning their faces like clocks, shrimp sweeping antenna across a waterline that never moves, but always passes. Time marks itself differently on roofs that are no longer roofs. Where a dome fell, its ribs rest like a crown on the floor, arcs intersecting to make geometry that tempts coral. Branching forms take the invitation, dividing and dividing again until a winter of stone becomes a spring of living branches, white by day, pale gold by late afternoon. An architecture that adds room for small lives while rehearsing a pentimento of the dome that used to hold sky instead of sea. Barrel vaults happen to guide current, and in their gentle accelerations and lulls, sand lines up in bars that teach gobies to wait where the silt clears and to dart when the dark shape of a hunting needlefish writes a sentence they've learned to read. On walls, plaques that once carried names now serve as breakwaters in miniature. Filaments of algae catch on their edges and thicken into shag. Limpets arrive, then barnacles, then small snails that graze clean paths visible for a day before a thin cloud of plankton turns the water milky and erases proof of breakfast. Hairline cracks host colonies of tiny stars that open and close with the tide's mathematics. Under their patient choreography, the stone adjusts to its gradual dissolution without losing composure. In niches where lamps once burned, glass has gathered, rolled, fogged, turned soft green, nestled among pebbles like fruit chilled and stored for a feast that never needed to be scheduled because the sea arrives always on time. There is industry here, quiet but continuous. Worms drill tubes and line them with grit. Clams inhale and exhale through siphons that draw patterns in the dust like calligraphy you can smudge with a single mistaken kick. Sea urchins rasp tiny caves into marble, their mouthparts carving with a diligence that would impress a sculptor. Even rust practices form where iron anchors or nails have slept. Oranges and reds bloom into voluminous sculptures that keep the outline of the thing they consume while becoming something else entirely. Fragile, strong, brittle, essential. Nets from later centuries lie as faint ghosts across lanes. Their weights describe parabolas along the paving. Their mesh catches nothing now but light and the occasional drift of eel grass that pretends, for an hour, to be cloth. The boundary between inside and outside has softened, but not vanished. You can still tell where a city tried to keep water out. Sills raised, thresholds thickened. culverts angled to speed rain toward the river. All that work remains, and the sea moves through it the way a reader moves through an old book, respectfully, turning pages with care, even when the paper has thinned. Gates have learned to open both ways. Arches frame not alleys, but alleys filled with water that is as much room as it is road. In some places, fresh water still seeps from the hill, emerging into salt with a blur that tastes sweet on the tongue. There, a curtain of life particular to the seam holds court, whose members can tolerate both stories and prefer the intersection where neither story minds. Artifacts pause everywhere, mid-sentence. A bowl sits in a shallow depression, rim chipped by a long-forgotten afternoon, now home to a circle of pale sponges that make a miniature colonnade, each poreless column filtering in a silence that turns out not to be silent when you put your ear near and hear the sea speaking in sand-sized syllables. A loom weight lies beside a doorway where a threshold stone has settled. Its hole is a cave for something the size of a grain of rice that waves two antennae like grass. A seal ring, still wearing its carved crest, has become the center of a tiny reef. Fish, the length of a finger, stand around it like viewers at a gallery, then vanish all at once as a shadow calmly redraws the room. You could spend an hour with a single tile and learn more about patience than from a week of watching sky. At the city's edge, where harbor becomes open water, the sea keeps the old geometry with a courtesy that feels like affection. The line of the breakwater is written in dunes of sand that reform each season according to the pressure of waves and the whisper of prevailing winds, transmitted through water. Gaps still act as gates. Fish gather there. Seals, if this is their latitude, use them like doors and pass with an assurance that suggests inherited memory. Beyond, the seabed drops along the same slope ships once followed, and if you hover where the depth steepens, the old sensation arrives unannounced, a sense that you are leaving or returning, that a city is behind or ahead of you, that the sea is not a place apart, but a long street that continues the map you know. Even light knows the plan. At midday, it falls in columns that align with colonnades. Late in the morning, it slides over steps in the same way feet used to, pooling on landings, discovering handrails worn smooth by palms that still seem present in the shape of the stone. At evening, it turns copper in the shallows and blue on the floors of deeper rooms, a two-tone quiet that feels like a conversation between past work and present rest. On storm days, the city goes invisible, and you would not know it is there, except for the way waves fold differently over hidden walls, their shoulders lifting a fraction, their backs writing a line of white that extends in an impossible straightness for yards and then dissolves as though embarrassed by the disclosure. If you stay long enough, you begin to see that the sea has not closed the book. It has added chapters written in a script that uses fins for punctuation and currents for tense. Streets are patrol routes for fish that switch leadership every minute. Plazas are arenas where silver shoals gather and explode into new patterns each time a predator arrives, like an idea. Temples host ceremonies of cleaning in which small fish tend larger ones at stations remembered from yesterday and promised tomorrow. The city's purpose has been edited but not erased. Where grain once moved, plankton moves. Where voices bargained, water measures itself against stone. Where prayers rose, bubbles rise, each letting go as if they know where they are headed without needing to hurry. And as you drift from corner to corner, touching only with your eyes and the smallest part of a glove, you realize the sea has kept not only the outline of rooms, but the rhythm of living inside them, adjusted for the long, slow tide that continues to turn the pages. The sea keeps its records in layers of quiet, and the first page is written with echoes. Sound goes out soft as a hand and comes back bearing shapes, side-scan stripes that reveal walls as pale ribs and their shadows as truth. Multi-beam fans that sweep the bottom into a quilt of depths where streets become smooth troughs and foundations stand as low plateaus. Sub-bottom pulses that slip beneath the visible floor and return with whispers of buried pavements, old canals, and riverbeds that remember the path they took before the water grew tall. Each pass adds a stitch. The picture sharpens not all at once, but by familiarity, the mind learning to read the way a right angle throws a darker shade than a dune. How a collapsed vault writes a crescent of chaos. How a stairway leaves a combed signature that repetition makes certain. Light writes the next page, but it needs help. Over the shallows, aircraft carry green lasers that pick through water clear enough to let them measure the curve of a drowned key. At low tides, drones drift steady over patterns that surface just long enough to be traced, their cameras stitching thousands of small images into a single gentle map. Underwater, lenses move slowly. Photogrammetry captures rooms and alleys, one frame at a time, and the algorithm that follows ties corners to corners until a 3D city stands in digital patience, each crack mapped, each stone given coordinates that a diver can return to by number, by memory, by the way light arrives at noon in late summer. On the surface, antennas fix positions against the sky with centimeter certainty. Below, where satellites cannot reach, acoustic beacons keep time for the divers and vehicles, clicking and answering in triangles until a point becomes a place, and a place becomes a plan. Magnetism makes a different kind of ink. Magnetometers harvest murmurs from objects the eye cannot find. A line of nails sleeping where a walkway was framed in timber. An anchor that rusted itself into a bloom the size of a small room. A hoard dashed from a pocket in a hurry, centuries ago, and sifted by silt into a tight, bright knot. The readings arrive as humps and dips against a baseline, small deviations that tell of iron, bronze, or fired clay, remembering the kiln's last embrace. Follow the line of anomalies, and a ship outlines itself in negatives. Follow a constellation of points, and a neighborhood of tools or fittings appears where a market once clanged with mourning. Currents are archivists too. In the long view they are faithful, dragging sand from here and laying it there with a logic repeated in seasons, and their habits can be read by the shapes they leave behind. Tales of sediment downstream from every block that rises. Scours where arches concentrate flow. Draped dunes where a paved road offers less resistance than rubble. Drift cards, wooden slats, and tagged seeds teach which ways the water likes to travel. Floating loggers tie temperature to motion. Dyes reveal how an eddy holds its breath behind a wall. By learning the grammar of motion, it becomes possible to guess where doors are buried, where drains empty, where small finds collect, as if cleaned nightly by a patient hand. When the time comes to touch, the sea is asked politely. Fins and hands move slow. A fan of the palm clears a window through silt, the way a reader brushes dust from a page. Airlifts and gentle dredges sip, rather than gulp, lifting grains into a hose that strains them through baskets where every shell and bead waits to be noticed. The smallest brushes return to service, bristles wicking water as they coax a relief from its shroud. A line is strung, a datum set, and each artifact's position is fixed within a grid, invisible to the fish, but permanent on the map. Nothing is hurried. The priority is context, because a jar alone is only a jar, but a jar beside a threshold opposite a drain under a lintel that faces south becomes a room that can be read, a routine that can be recognized, a day that can be imagined. Cores rise like candles of time from mud that looks uniform until it is coaxed into story. A centimeter may hold a year, a thumb's width, a decade. Pollen grains speak for fields that waved beyond the harbor. Olive, grape, barley, each with a shape that cannot be mistaken once learned. Diatoms mark salinity like careful clerks. The species that prefer brackish lanes multiply when the sea first breathes into the river's mouth. And fresh water forms swell again if a channel shifts and an inlet closes. Charcoal specks arrive or fall away with the history of cooking fires, of workshops, of short, cool burns in tidy streets. The ratio of heavy to light minerals swings with flood seasons. The color deepens where organic matter settled in quiet years and lightens where storms combed the bottom clean. Even lead and copper leave faint fingerprints when trade grew busy and wares were worked at the water's edge. Stones tell their own version. Beach rock fixes a shoreline like a signature. Date it, and the line of high water in that age writes itself across a coast. Corals set their upward limits where they can breathe. Their dead heads, now below, mark levels climbed since. Dendrochronology reaches unexpected fingers into this world, because stumps from forests drowned by the advancing sea keep rings that align with trees on land, granting a year to the moment the tide first learned their names. Pottery pulls the timeline tight when motifs and fabrics match catalogued styles. Coins insist on earliest possibilities with their emperors and their mints. Glass recipes shift in ratios that can be traced to furnaces known by region and century, and a fragment of a bottle is enough to place a room on a calendar, generous enough to hold uncertainty without losing clarity. Not every page can be turned without cost, so many are left unturned on purpose. Preservation in place is a quiet decision repeated often. To leave a wall under sand where oxygen cannot gnaw. To recover a mosaic with a blanket of clean sediment and a sheet that discourages burrowers. To fence a wreck with nothing more than a curtain of water and a plea to leave silence intact. Where exposure is inevitable, protective cloaks go down, geotextiles pinned at the corners, sandbags tucked like pillows along edges, a low, temporary dune built by hand to catch the habit of a current and persuade it to lay its cargo here rather than there. A city can be mapped, measured, and understood without being emptied of its sleep. And that choice is itself a shape on the chart. Tools have their voices and their limits. Sonar blurs where the bottom is too soft or the waves too busy. Lasers fail in milk-green water. Magnets ignore stone with a dignity that refuses mistake. So senses are combined the way musicians blend instruments. Echoes outline, light confirms, touch refines, cores explain, chemistry dates, and the story settles into coherence, without any single line claiming the right to speak alone. Even memory joins the ensemble. Pilots who remember a bump under keel at a certain bearing. Fishers who avoid a patch because nets tear there. A name on a coastal chart that hints at a road or a wall hiding in plain sound. Local knowledge passed across docks and through kitchens places flags on the map that careful ships and slow divers learn never to ignore. Weather adds its own punctuation to the reading. Spring carries clarity and long light, but also swift freshets that turn rivers to tea. Summer warms the shallow layers and calls plankton to bloom, drowsing water into green velvet. Autumn returns reach, sometimes with winds that fold the sea into dangerous ideas. Winter offers steel-blue windows between storms, when visibility stretches so far that even ruins seem to lift toward the surface as if to be counted. Work moves with these cadences rather than against them, and the archive rewards those who match their breath to its seasons. Across years, the map thickens with trace, blocks labeled not only with numbers, but with sentences, lintel carved with rosette, threshold with pivot socket, drain to east channel, link to models that anyone can spin in the palm of a screen, to cores whose layers have been translated into graphs gentle enough to read before sleep, to tables where dates gather like constellations around a century that feels more certain with each alignment. Each revisit adds a layer of understanding rather than a subtraction of material. Each survey after a storm notes what shifted and what kept faith. Each conversation with the sea grows easier to follow, because the ear learns its rhythms and the eye learns its preferred disguises. The archive extends beyond stone and clay. DNA drifts in the water and settles in mud, fragments from fish, mollusk, and plant that compose inventories of life before hooks changed habits and levees trimmed floodplains. Isotopes in shells carry the temperature and the taste of seasons. Trace elements link ores to distant hills and lay threads along which trade must have moved. Wear on steps tells where feet chose to pass. Polish on a keystone suggests rope against stone, repeated enough to round crystal into gloss. Even the absence of certain things, a lack of hearth ash in one quarter, the silence of slag in another, shapes districts, directs imagination, sets daily routes for bakers and smiths, who are not seen and yet are present in every measured void. Care turns reading into listening. Gloves pause before brushing. Fins hover without stirring. Notes are made simple and soon, while detail is still wet on the mind. Work ends when the light leans, or the current's hum goes from companion to complaint, and the city is left as it was, only slightly more known, which is different from being more exposed. On the boat, silt settles in trays, maps dry with salt's faint lace at the edges, and small objects, no longer small when seen properly, rest in damp, dark boxes until their turn to speak. Back on land, tanks sigh. Computers knit models overnight. Cores slice into thin samplers that carry 1,000 years in a strip the width of a finger. And the sea waits, patient and exacting, ready to offer the next page to the same hands that have learned how to turn it gently. Morning begins with the tide checking the doorstep. Doors open to a light that smells of salt and stone warmed by yesterday, and a thin sheet of water withdraws across the courtyard with the soft sound of wet parchment pulled from a table. In the narrow lanes, swept clean by a night breeze that ferried cool air down from the hills, bakers slide flat loaves onto stones that hold heat like old promises. The crusts lift and crackle in a language everyone understands. Women rinse herbs in a clay basin where rain and sea meet by a finger's breadth, the leaves brightening as they shed grit. A boy counts the pulses of a small wave tapping the basin's lip, learning without being taught how long before the harbor slackens. Cats move along parapets with salt-white whiskers. Gulls announce themselves on the roofline. A bell made of bronze, nudged thin by years' rings once to say the kiln has woken. The shore is a workshop and a kitchen, a market and a road. Nets hang from poles like patient curtains, drops of last night's water stepping off them in a glittering script, fingers that know every knot by feel, lift, test, and mend. Boat ribs lie open to the morning sun, their steam-bent arcs cooling under wet cloths. A shipwright touches each with the back of his hand and hears the tone the wood answers in. Children carry small pails to the strand line and return with shells that will become lime for mortar. Older hands lift amphorae by the twin ears and walk in a rhythm that matches their breath to the slope of the lane. On the quay, fish spill silver into baskets. The air carries a sweetness from crushed fennel, a sharpness from brine, a hint of smoke where a brazier warms oil for the first frying pan of the day. The town keeps time with water as much as with sun. A notch on the harbour wall has been rubbed smooth by generations of pointing. Fathers tap it with a knuckle to show where the spring high should reach, and today it reaches one finger higher. A line of pebbles set into the quay face becomes a vertical calendar, each stone a remembered season. Someone adds a new pebble, not in alarm, but to keep faith with the habit of noticing. A boy runs to fetch his grandmother when a moon jelly wafts into the basin and trembles like a lantern. She laughs softly and tells him the name her mother had for such a creature, a name that contains both shore and sky. Traders eye the flags at the mouth of the bay to see which way the breeze will bend the return crossing. Potters tap the shoulders of cooling jars to hear if the clay has tightened enough to hold oil without weeping. Inside the houses, walls remember storms and summers in the same breath. Thresholds have been raised by thin courses of stone, small lifts measured against knees and ankles, so that water that used to step into rooms now hesitates and curls back. Floors slope toward drains fitted with clay mouths that sip and sigh. Above them, wooden racks hold baskets and bedding, clear of any surprise visits from the tide. Sleeping platforms double as storerooms, drawers carved into the thickness of the wall keep salt dry and grain out of the reach of damp and mouse alike. Windows lean narrow into the wind and widen toward the lee, teaching air to flow. Shutters are hung on cords that won't swell in humid hours. On roof flats, herbs sit in terracotta mouths that sip moisture through porous sides, and on some roofs, shallow cisterns mirror the sky in perfect squares, their lids lifted just after a shower to fill pitchers with water that tastes of lime and cloud. The edge between land and water is not a line, but a conversation, and everyone speaks it. Shepherds bring flocks down to the marsh fringe when the grass inland browns. The animals learn the firm paths by hoof and graze, where sedges root soil in place. Farmers plant beans on raised ribs of earth between shallow, flooded beds. The ribs are narrow enough to step across without wetting a hem, and the beans climb strings that hum when the sea breeze finds them. Gardens retreat by a yard each few years, and as they go, fruit trees are lifted and replanted. A fig carried by 4 hands, its roots wrapped in damp cloth, its branches tied with string, so they do not bruise one another. Terrace walls climb a stone higher. The slope wears new scars that heal into levels, and water finds a slower way downhill, lending time to the roots that hold it. Boats are an extension of the street and of the mind. Ferries shuttle between quays before breakfast, their routes learned like the sequences of a prayer. Children step aboard and learn how a hull speaks through the soles of their feet. Oarsmen listen to the shallows. When the sea lifts in a breath over a hidden wall, they adjust by inches to spare both keel and stone. Sailors tie knots whose names include places and winds. They coil lines in spirals that sit like sleeping snakes. At dusk, lanterns are lit and set afloat at festival time. Hundreds of small suns drifting toward the harbor mouth, their reflections writing trembling paths across the water until they look like the oldest stars returning. Names are murmured with each lantern: a lost father, a safe voyage, a field that needs rain, but not too much, and the sea accepts them without hierarchy. Craft follows the tide, the way a shadow follows a shoulder. Weavers hang warp threads between posts set in packed sand and align their work to the morning calm. The cloth grows with the day, the shuttle sliding while the water slides, and pausing when the afternoon breeze arrives, like a friend who talks too loudly for weaving. Tanners scrape hides on stones washed daily by a trickle that arrives with every ebb. The smell is strong but honest, and the leather they make resists salt better than the inland kind. Dyers boil vats the color of night from shells gathered in secret at low tide. Threads lifted from the pot look black until the air touches them, and then a purple climbs through like a sunrise kept private. Masons turn slipways into ramps with grooves for rollers, judging their angles by the way water reaches on a moon-swollen day. A single town becomes 24 practiced hands, each measuring their skill against the patience of the sea. Stories live where work rests. In the shade of a long wall, a singer recites the names of the two lovers who met where the river's taste changed, and even the children, too young to care about love, listen for the part described in Gulls and Wind because they know those voices intimately. Fishermen pass along landmarks that exist only when the tide is low. A rock shaped like a sleeping dog, a pile of stones that turns into a triangle, a ripple that always lies across the channel just so. Parents teach their children the quiet arithmetic of safety, how a sky with no wind and small waves can still be dangerous when the water breathes differently, how the river behaves after 3 days of rain in the hills, how to watch the color of the sandy bottom change with a cloud, a hint that depth has stepped down. Old people sit on the highest step and count sails. They call out boat names softly and remember which families belong to which hulls. Festivals mark the year as much as seasons of planting and harvest. There is a day when the first shoal returns, and cooks take out clay plates only for this meal. A day when boats grow garlands and race in circuits that follow the old ferry routes. A day when hands lay bread on the quay for ancestors who built the wall. Lamps are hung on poles at the tide's farthest reach. When the water touches the lamp shadows, someone stamps 3 times, and the stamping moves along the promenade like a slow drum. Songs pair the moon's phases with tasks, mending on the waxing, net casting on the waning, travel on the standstill. Night markets open when the heat leaves the stone, fish spread on crushed ice that gleams like new marble. Water sellers dip ladles into jars sunk in cool sand. Storytellers trade details about storms that changed the map and storms that did not. Not all change is gentle, and the town keeps a disciplined tenderness for days when the sea oversteps. Doors are latched not against water, but to keep them from swing and bruise. Shutters are barred in a way that leaves a small gap for pressure to ease. Jars are padded with rags in their niches. Heavy furniture is chalked around the feet and slid back a hand's breadth in readiness. When wind drives water into the harbor, the first to move are those without boats. They carry a neighbor's baskets, lift a child, fetch a bundle of reeds to wedge under a skiff so it will rise without scraping. After the blow, the streets fill with the careful work of setting back to rights, sweeping in lines that carry sand to a low corner saved for it, washing salt from vine leaves with rainwater saved for just this, flipping roof tiles that have learned new angles, writing a small shrine with the patience it offered them. Trade stitches the shore to distant points without unthreading the town's fabric. Foreign jars arrive smelling of resin. Their shapes are new, but their burdens are familiar. Oil, wine, grain, sweet things sealed with wax. Trodden paths glow with crushed shells that hold a pearl's tame light. The market learns new words that describe spices and cloth. Stones you can wear, stones you can grind into paint. Fishermen swap techniques with strangers who know different fish and different winds. A new knot appears on the quay. A new stitch binds net to head rope with less effort when cold numbs thumbs. Maps are not drawn, but spoken, and they include the mood of a cape, the forgiveness of a channel, the unexpected courtesy of an island that throws a shadow just when you need it. Inland, a second town keeps pace with the first. People move goods up the river by shallow draft boats pushed with poles. Others lead donkeys along causeways whose surfaces are paved with flint and shell. Beyond the marsh, granaries sit on high ankles of wood, given greased skins against rats and damp. A hill shrine, older than the harbour, looks down on the now broader glint of water. Its priests keep weather in their scrolls and in the curl of their ears, more than in stars. The inland and the shore trade not only goods, but habits. Upland fields learn to terrace against rain that arrives with longer hands. Seaside roofs borrow red tiles that shed downpours cleanly. Everyone practices the art of making room for the next inch of water without surrendering more than a step. Children learn the edge by play. They float little boats made of bark and leaf in ditches that fill and empty with the tide, racing them by breath and by finger. They count the steps to the market door when the water is high and when it is low, and chant the numbers as if they are charms, which, in a way, they are. They know which stones always wobble and which never do, where the warm water rests at noon in late summer, how to find crabs by sound rather than sight. The first time a child is allowed to carry a lantern down the quay at night, the town becomes theirs. Reflections, voices, the long black ribbon of the harbour mouth, and the far buoy that winks a language only boats and bedtime understand. The sea is a neighbour who attends births and funerals with the same readiness. When a baby comes in a hot month, midwives cool cloth in a basin that tastes of both rain and tide. When an elder passes, neighbours rinse the threshold with sea water and then sweet water, and hang a wreath of reeds that dry into a grey-green, crackling softly when the door opens. Names reflect weather. A boy called for the day a shoal arrived and rescued a lean season, a girl named for the wind that held steady. The night a boat returned early. Love promises are made not with rings only, but with shared chores timed to tide, a pledge to mend nets at dawn through winter, to fetch water when the moon wanes and the well tastes of limestone, to listen at night when the swell shifts and one of them hears it first. The animals know the schedule as well as the people. Dogs wait where boats kiss the quay. They can smell the crew before the hulls rub against stone, says the same. Donkeys step higher onto the causeway on days when the marsh water stands. Their hooves choose the old marks without looking. Swallows arrive in a velvet moth hour and stitch their bodies into the air above the lane that funnels insects up from reed to eave. Eels ride the river's vein to salt without being taught. Herons move like calligraphy along the mud's edge, then freeze into punctuation when a hand lifts in greeting from a rooftop. As years gather, small changes accumulate into habit. A certain doorway gains 2 more stones under the threshold. A bench migrates across a courtyard toward a corner that catches the new angle of afternoon light. A shop hangs a bell higher because the salt in the air teaches it a sticky note in early summer. A family that lived on the lowest lane now lives 1 house higher. Their old door becomes a storehouse where nets dry and amphorae cool. The new door takes the house's stories forward without embarrassment. Maps scratched into the plaster of a storeroom wall are updated with a nail. A new inlet, a deepened channel, the loss of a spit that everyone used to walk for the first cockles of spring. The town's memory is written into lintels in 3 different stones, into the curve of a worn stair, into the way everyone turns their head when a certain wind arrives with a smell from far offshore that says a current has changed its mind. Through it all, the days remain ordinary in the way that keeps a place alive. Meals are eaten on shaded thresholds where the air moves. Laundry is rinsed in water that swirls and clears, then carried to roofs where it snaps gently in a breeze that knows what to do. A neighbor borrows a jar and returns it with a sprig of herb tucked under the handle. A child sits with a grandparent on the step that meets the lane and counts the boats, the bread loaves, the gulls, the lamplights, the rings on the harbor wall where someone's fingertip once rested and where it will rest again tomorrow, measuring nothing and everything at once, in a town that listens to the sea and answers in the steady work of living. The sea remembers in textures first. It keeps the grain of a chisel in a softened lintel and carries that touch forward as a faint groove that catches moonlight when the water thins. It remembers footsteps as a polish on stair edges that glows under a column of noon, the gloss reanimated by grazing snails, as if souls and shells shared a pact about the way stone should shine. It remembers the weight of doors in hinges rusted into orange flowers that mimic the petals carved on nearby capitals. It keeps the rhythm of a market in the steady traffic of fish that turn corners where stalls once stood, their silver bodies striking the same angles that once guided baskets and shawls. It is not only the outlines the sea preserves, it is the habits of matter, the way a threshold invites passage, the way a key collects the world, the way a courtyard catches a square of sky and teaches everything within its walls to look up. It remembers in layers of sound. Storm swells rehearse the bass of old oars, and in the pause between one wave and the next, there is enough quiet to hear sand shifting like dry grain along the base of a buried wall. Shrimps snap in galleries that used to be drains. A fish taps a pot's shoulder with a sound indistinguishable from a fingertip's test of a fired jar. Distant surf repeats the crowd murmur of a festival night, the cadence slightly altered, but close enough for ghosts to nod. On certain afternoons, when the surface lies still, air bubbles rise from cracks in old pavements with the politeness of speech bubbles, and if you put your ear close, you can hear a fizz that reads as words without needing to translate. It remembers by growing. Coral measures a column and reimagines it as a branching tree. Encrusting sponges take the plan of a plinth and soften it into a cushion whose pores filter the city back into clarity. Bryozoans lace the face of a fallen arch with a curtain delicate enough to let light through and strong enough to tame a pushy current. Past and present overlay into a single structure that a hand can't separate because separation is no longer the point. Each polyp contributes a fraction of a room. Each tube worm builds a bead of stone. Together, they stitch a version of the building that breathes. When you hover, the page appears to turn by itself. Little mouths opening, cilia waving, silt settling in the breath of creatures that forgot to be in a hurry. It remembers in chemistry. Iron blooms wherever nails once held wood. The oxidation draws oranges and burgundies onto the seabed, a slow fresco painting itself in the shape of forgotten carpentry. Salt writes itself into bone and wood, preserving form while changing the alphabet. In cold, quiet layers, the change pauses, then resumes when a storm rearranges shelves and drawers and exposes a different paragraph. Limestone answers with dissolution and donation, offering ions to the water that become shells elsewhere, so that a carved dolphin loses a grin but is reborn as a scallop's fan a bay away. Even the breath of living things takes notes. Carbon from cooking fires sleeps in sediments and later appears in the tissue of a turtle that grazes a lawn of algae growing on a temple step, a small circle closed without fuss. It remembers by arranging light. Midday divides rooms into bands, pale panes across mosaics, blue-green pools beneath thresholds, a shimmer on the far wall that acts like a hidden window. Late afternoon warms the shallows into copper and turns the deeper floors the color of ink. A passing cloud pulls a slow eclipse over a street, and the fish respond as if to a hand signal, bunching, relaxing, resuming their patrol. On moonlit nights, when the surface is a sheet of tarnished silver and the sea breathes long, plankton flare at the brush of fin and oar. Raindrops stamp coins of cold fire that drift down and fade on the old stones. And for a few minutes the drowned city glitters with small, polite stars. It remembers the weight of names even when letters are gone. A harbour mouth still aims toward a trade wind. A breakwater still throws a protective shoulder against a swell from the quarter that caused trouble, since before repetition had a word. A lane still runs from high ground to low by the gentlest gradient, because feet never argued with gravity. A well keeps sweet longer than those around it, because its spring learned to hide from salt in a seam of shale. Fisher routes follow contours set by masonry as much as by bedrock, and seals or their kin pause in the same gaps that served as gates, watching from the doorway as if expecting a shout that won't come and doesn't need to. It remembers by collecting. In the lee of a wall, artifacts gather in a hush. A spindle whorl that settled beside a pin long enough for both to acquire a fringe of lime. A coin whose emperor has smoothed into a sun. A glass bead that swallowed the sea's color, and now, when turned, returns a fraction of sky. A brass weight lies within an arm's length of a clay token stamped with a barley head. Together they reconstruct a transaction without witnesses. A child's toy boat, 2 inches of carved wood, sleeps in a silt pocket so perfectly shaped it feels designed. The sea has kept it by accident and by intention, both at once, which is the sea's specialty. It remembers by moving slowly and by moving all at once. For a decade, nothing shifts that anyone can see. Then a single winter storm finds a new path, combs a corner clean, and there is a doorway with its pivot stone still oiled by a century of use, the hollow glowing like an eye. For a year, visibility runs like tea, and the city feels far. Then a sequence of cold, clear mornings opens a window as wide as a plaza, and you can read the joints between blocks as if the mason left yesterday. Continuity doesn't mean stillness. It means rhythm, and the rhythm is long enough to be generous. It remembers people in the ways that weather remembers faces. The place where hands always reached to steady themselves on a certain corner. That spot is smoother than the rest and hosts a constellation of small shells, as if touch attracts habitation forever. The step where lovers used to sit at dusk, that edge has worn a curve perfectly matching a thigh, and is now a favored ledge for resting wrasse. They drift there in the same arrangement of 2 and 3. The wall that shaded midwives while they waited, its base grows the richest lawn of algae, and at noon a school of tiny fish gather in its shadow, like a crowd that has learned to lower its voice. Memory is faithful to postures, even when names have fallen silent. It remembers roots as if they were drawn in current. Water finds the straight streets and hurries. It slows in squares and leaves a thin film of finer sand, the color of toast. It curls around columns and braids itself in narrow alleys, leaving alternating bands of shine and dull that read like the warp and weft of a city-wide cloth. Juvenile fish learn these flows the way children learned shortcuts. They know which corner offers protection from a hard push, which window ledge always holds a pocket of calm. Tides perform the same choreography twice a day, with improvisations so subtle you only notice after years, the way you only notice that someone you love has grown older when a photograph finds you unprepared. It remembers with the help of strangers. Pelagic wanderers bottom on their way past. A turtle's scute scrapes a frieze and leaves a line that will guide the eye next summer. A migrating ray drops a necklace of sand in a chamber like a chalk outline. A whale passes far above, and its low word presses the water column down so gently that a veil of silt lifts and resettles 1 pebble width to the right, improving the composition of a doorway for viewers who have never thought about composition and don't need to. Birds stitch the surface, dropping feathers that lodge in crevices. Feathers gather algae. Algae catch seeds. A small garden forms in a place that forgot it could. It remembers erasure as part of memory. Not everything persists. Some rooms are rewritten into dunes. Some carvings dissolve into pastel clouds. Some amphora collapse into rings of shoulder and base. The loss is not a betrayal. It is a page turned. What disappears becomes the material for what appears a courtyard away. A column becomes grit, becomes glue for a snail's shell that gleams like a coin in a child's eye 5 lifetimes later. The city continues to circulate itself as oxygen does, calming the idea that the present must always replace the past when it can also carry it. It remembers the weather's handwriting. Years of clear winter water lay thin, bright lines over floors. Summers of bloom record themselves as soft green quilts. A season of storms scallops the edges of every block, creating a language of commas and apostrophes along ledges. A calm year burnishes surfaces until they throw reflections up onto ceilings that no longer exist, painting ghost rooms onto water. You can date a corner by its texture and a step by the coarseness of the sand in its joints. The way an archivist understands a document by the fiber of its paper. and the cut of its letters. It remembers smell, although you cannot keep it in a jar. Brine and iodine, and brass and limestone, and a faint anise from crushed fennel seeds that a pot still leaks when the sun warms it, and the sweeter, colder mineral of fresh seep, where a spring enters under a wall. Put your face near a chin-high crack and inhale, and there is cellar and rope and a bakery that closed a very long time ago. This is not nostalgia. It is inventory, sensory minutes stacked like tiles in the dark. It remembers the idea of refuge. Even fish that were not part of the city's story recognize doorways as good ideas and arches as invitations. Storm-frightened creatures crowd into atriums when the water above turns white and wild. After the blow, they leave in quiet order, and the atrium resumes its daily occupation of being a theatre for light and silt. When heat presses the shallows into a thick stew, colder tongues of water that slip through culverts become summer boulevards. When cold bites, sun-warmed ledges along southern walls draw life in stripes. The city continues to host seasons. Only now those seasons swim. It remembers to teach. Divers learn patience, not as a virtue, but as a method. Currents teach humility without spectacle. Silt insists on gentleness. The map teaches that right angles are rare in nature, and therefore meaningful when they appear. The sea has no interest in drama, and the city beneath it has no interest in being a ruin. Together they stage a long lesson about change that includes endurance without requiring repetition and novelty without insisting on surprise. Tools improve, but attention is the only instrument that always finds something new. It remembers across scales. A grain of sand scratches a line across a shard of glass that becomes a groove for a diatom to anchor, to which becomes a foothold for a larger algae that becomes shade for a snail that grazes in a circle, that becomes a pattern that catches your eye, so that you notice the curve of a staircase reflected at an angle that leads you to a doorway no one had mapped. Each notice begets a next notice, and the city expands in the mind every time someone breathes slowly enough to follow the chain. It remembers not by holding everything, but by repeating essentials until they are unmistakable. Welcome and edge, shelter and passage, offering and return. The sea rehearses these with the steadiness of a tide, and the quiet rooms below accept the part, their floors ready for fins, their walls ready for light, their thresholds ready for whatever foot comes next, whether scaled or bare, whether it belongs to a stranger or to someone who has always lived here in water or in air. And in that agreement, the drowned places continue to speak in present tense, telling the same story differently each day. Patient as tide, exact as stone, soft as silt, luminous as a column of noon poured down through the open square of a courtyard that still keeps its sky. Thank you for drifting through these quiet cities beneath the sea with me tonight. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. History will keep. If this gentle journey soothed you, tap like and subscribe so the next story finds you. Share the moment that stayed with you and what world you'd like to explore next. Until then, breathe with the tide, rest deeply, and I'll meet you in the next chapter of the night. Good night.